Hello, everybody. Welcome to tonight's event with Jane Austen and Company. We'll get started in just a minute, but as you enter into this space and get settled in, we would love to hear where you are joining us from, and also what the weather is like where you're at currently. I see a lot of people have already made comments in the chat, so please feel free to add that. Sydney, Australia, represented. We've got North Carolinians, of course. California, Montreal, Florida. Wonderful. Welcome in, everybody. It's great that we have such a good turnout tonight, and we April is doing well. All right. Yeah, please, if you're joining, add in your location, weather. I see Cambridge, Massachusetts, rainy and cold.
Yeah, Rhode Island, cloudy.
It is. In Texas, where I'm at, very sunny and way too hot for April. And soon it's going to be ridiculously hot. But greetings, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Eric Bontempo. I am a co-director of Jane Austen and Company, and also the co-director of the Jane Austen Summer Program. And I'm joined tonight by Deb Barnum and our technical director, Nadea Pugh. At Jane Austen and Company, we are here to spotlight Jane Austen and women's literary traditions more generally. And we are so excited that in this series, we're getting to read and think about the Bronte sisters in relation to Jane Austen. At the outset of tonight's program, we would like to thank the North Carolina for their generous support. North Carolina Humanities is a statewide nonprofit and the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which connects North Carolinians with cultural experiences that spur dialogue, deepen human connections, and inspire community. Their funding has played a significant role in making this series possible.
So tonight is the third event in our Austen and Bronte series. Our first event was a live performance of Diana Burchell's play, You Are Passionate, Jane, which depicts a conversation between Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte in the afterlife. Diana played Charlotte and Siri James played Jane. The performance was great fun, and it was followed by a Q&A with Diana and Siri that was fabulous. And we highly recommend that you check it out. It is online, the recording, and you can go to the website if Nadea wants to put that in the chat, janeaustenandco.org. And then on April 2nd, we were joined by Leslie Peterson, who gave an outstanding creative writing workshop on the art of the rave, looking at examples from Shakespeare, Jane Austen, and Emily Bronte. And that is also available online.
Yeah, yes. If you were there, myself and perhaps many of you in the audience took a stab at crafting a rave in real time. And if you go back and watch the recording, you can hear my fictional character, Abelinia, rave in the style of Jane Austen about her lost puppy, Percy. It was quite the dramatic situation, and several of you created your own dramatic situations. In conjunction with that writing workshop a few weeks ago, Jane Austen and Company is currently having a writing contest, and the deadline is this Friday, April 19th. So there still is time for you to check out the guidelines on our website and to learn about the prizes, which include a 50% scholarship to our 2025 Jane Austen Summer Program in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And of course, we want everyone attending this event to participate in this contest, but we're also hoping to get your help advertising this contest to your own local communities. If you're a teacher or a librarian or a parent or any kind of educator, we invite you to share this link with others, especially high school students and middle school students. And so here's the basic prompt that you can for this contest that you can find on our website. Jane Austen and the Brontes sometimes create characters who find themselves in situations that prompt them to write passionate letters expressing love, distress, or other strong emotions. Some of these most famously include Darcy's letter to Elizabeth after his first proposal, Captain Wentworth's letter of half agony, half hope to Anne Elliot, Isabella Linton's brooding letter to Nellie in Wuthering Heights, the dispassionate letter that Mr. Rochester writes to Jane Eyre, inviting her to become governess to Adele. And also there's St. John Rivers' ominous letter to Jane at the very end of the novel.
So now, in your own imaginative space, pretend that you are Jane Austen, one of the Bronte sisters, or one of their characters. Write an emotional letter on the topic of your choice in their style. For example, maybe you could take on the persona of Isabella Thorpe from Northanger Abbey and write a brooding Gothic letter about some drama that you had with a college roommate. Again, this contest is open to all ages. There are separate age categories. We'll select one winner from the 18 and under and one winner from the 18 plus category. Both winners will be awarded a 50% scholarship to our 2025 Jane Austen Summer Program that will take place in Chapel Hill. And you will also receive a beautiful gift box set to tide you over because summer of 2025 is a long way from now. So we are very excited to see your submissions. And as you know, you only have 24 hours to do it. So we hope that you do. So Eric now will introduce our speaker, Talia Schaffer.
All right. We are so happy and honored that Talia Schaffer has joined us this evening. Talia Schaffer is a distinguished professor of English at Queens College CUNY and the Graduate Center CUNY. She is the author of Communities of Care, The Social Ethics of Victorian Fiction, which was published in 2021 and shortlisted for the Literary Encyclopedia Book Prize. She's also the author of Romance's Rival, Familiar Marriage in Victorian Fiction, which was published in 2016 and won the NAVSA Prize for the Best Book of the Year. In 2011, Talia published her book Novelcraft, Victorian Domestic Handicraft and 19th-Century Fiction. And there's also her first book, The Forgotten Female Aesthetes, Literary Culture in Late-Victorian England. Her co-edited volumes include the Routledge Companion to Victorian Literature, co-edited with Dennis Denisoff, a special issue of the Victorian Review entitled Extending Families, co-edited with Kelly Hager, and Women and British Aestheticism, co-edited with Psomiades. Talia has also edited Literature and Culture at the Fin de Siècle and Lucas Malet's 1901 novel, The History of Sir Richard Calmady. Schaffer has published more than 50 articles on topics including Victorian familial and marital norms, disability studies, ethical readings, women writers, material culture, popular fiction, and aestheticism. And we are thrilled that Talia is joining us this evening. Before we jump into Talia's talk, our technical director, Nadea, will explain how you can send in your questions and responses throughout the evening.
Thank you, Eric. Hi, everybody. Welcome to YouTube, our streaming platform. If you'd like to leave a comment or ask a question, you can use the comment feature on the sidebar, and we'll be keeping an eye on the comments throughout Talia's presentation. If she can, and if she chooses to, she'll respond to the comments as we go, but otherwise she'll respond to them during the Q&A after the workshop. Or after the presentation, excuse me. You will need to log into your Google or YouTube account to post a comment in that sidebar, but if you don't have a YouTube or Google account, that's okay as well. And you can just submit your questions to us via email at info@janeaustenandco.org. And we'll collect questions and comments there as well and post those in the chat for you. And our speakers love hearing from our audience, so please, please, please share your thoughts.
So thank you, Nadea. And now, without further ado, Talia Schaffer.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much, everybody. It's such an honor to be part of this wonderful organization. I've been following Jane Austen and Company for a long time, and I'm really thrilled to get to speak at one of their events. Special thanks to Eric, Deb, David, and Nadea for organizing this and running the tech. And thank you to all of you for coming to the talk. I am so pleased to be with you today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your comments and questions. Okay, the next slide, please. Today, I'm going to be speaking about some ideas from my recent book, which Eric mentioned, Communities of Care, in which I argue for the importance of collective caregiving, both as a structure that we need to understand the past and as a model of mutual aid that we can use today. So I've put some of the terms on the slide that are sort of key to this book and that I'm going to be using in today's presentation. I define care this way: meeting another's need. And I stress that care is an action, not a feeling. So I'm not going to read the long quotes on the slide. They're there if you want more information, but that's basically kind of what you need for today. I'm going to give you a quick overview of what I'll be arguing today. This is all going to get detailed later on. But this idea of care was widely accepted in the early 19th century in Britain, which is how I learned about it. As a Victorianist who reads 19th century texts, I was noticing how care was operating and operating as a kind of social bond. In this period, suffering was considered an inevitable part of ordinary life, and people accepted the responsibility of helping others bear their suffering more easily. They formed themselves into communities of care to help those in need. These kinds of groups could include family, friends, neighbors, anyone who wanted to contribute. Next slide, please. Thank you. In the middle of the 19th century, however, a new medical model began to emerge. Instead of thinking of varied bodily experiences as ordinary, people started to believe that health was the norm, and that use of the term norm or normal emerges in the 1830s. They started to regard disability and disease as exceptional states that needed to be cured. Amateur caregiving started to fall out of fashion to be replaced by professional medicine. And I want to just point out that the top image here is a picture of the traditional way, traditional caregiving. You can see there's a servant in the background preparing some nourishing meal, somebody reading to the patient, somebody else plumping the pillow. There's a lot of there's people surrounding her, there's physical contact with her, there's attention to her comfort and her interest. The bottom right is a famous painting called The Doctor, and you see there the beginnings of the medical model. The parents are actually behind the chairs. They cannot reach their sick child. They are sidelined. The doctor is gazing intently at the child. The doctor has the medicine there, and the light is falling on the doctor's face. It's his attention, his interest, his professional gaze that is going to determine this child's well-being. And although this is seen as a very inspirational portrait of a doctor, I know which patient I would rather be. I'd rather be the one, I think, who has a lot of people taking care of her. So anyway, what I want to do today is to compare Austen and Bronte in order to trace the trajectory from that top picture to that bottom picture, and to give us new insights into the role that suffering plays in each of the novels. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I put on these pictures to show you that Persuasion and Jane Eyre were published really only 30 years apart. So they're arguably at extreme ends of the same generation. It's not surprising then that Austen and Bronte agree about the need for care communities. Both highlight the isolation and misery of being out of relation, of having nobody around you to help. Both authors treated the desire for care communities as a way to move the plot ahead, to motivate characters, and to alter social ties in their novels. And they both felt strongly that anyone who lacked such a care situation was in a tragic situation. But Bronte, because she was writing at mid-century, was also dealing with that emerging new medical system. And so I think you're going to find that the scenes of bodily and mental distress in Jane Eyre work interestingly differently than they do in Persuasion. So in today's talk, I'm going to give you some brief history about how the 19th century care community worked. Then also briefly, I'm going to compare 3 key scenes in Persuasion and Jane Eyre. One towards the beginning of the novel where a child gets hurt. A second climactic scene, next slide please, where a woman suffers a catastrophic fall. And a scene at the end of the novel where someone is living with a permanent visible disability. And by the way, I should just note that I've simply decided that you all know these novels really well, so I'm not going to give a plot summary or anything. I'm hoping that what I say today will be self-evident, but please, in the Q&A or in the comments section, if I'm mentioning something and you want to know more about it, please just ask me. But in each of these cases, the three cases of the child, the fallen woman, and the final disabled person, I want to pay special attention to the question of who is giving care. What we're going to see overall, and you can see it even in these images, is that Austen depicts a much more populated world in which people rush in to give help. People who were once isolated find relief in pulling such a community around themselves. The loving network makes all the difference to them. The construction of a care community and the complex currents of interrelationships within that care community are indeed arguably what persuasion is all about. It makes the work of persuasion possible. But in the world of Charlotte Bronte, the image on the right, people fall and die with perhaps one or two uncaring helpers or none. Care communities are thin on the ground, and the characters suffer accordingly. In Jane Eyre, Bronte depicts the dangerous and distressing experience of trying to survive without care. From our modern perspective, it is easy to see medical history as progress. We are moving towards scientific knowledge and effective medical treatment. Germs, antiseptics, we're learning these things. But what I want to stress today is that at the time, this was felt as a loss. And if we want to do justice to these two novels, we need to register that fact. We need to do it justice. The pleasure of persuasion is that the people whom we want to step up and help do so. The agony of Jane Eyre is that people do not. Next slide, please. Okay, brief history with the help of William P. Frith, who painted this painting, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So in the early 19th century, everyone needed care. And if you think about it for a minute, you'll understand why, right? The causes of most illnesses remained largely mysterious. Treatments were haphazard, and the lack of germ theory, antiseptics, and nutritional information, also ventilation and things like that, meant that ill health was widespread, while a moment's disaster could be fatal. Long before X-rays, the interior of the body remained obscure. Who knew what really caused symptoms? Impairments were not only more common, but also much more visible than they are for us today, because back then, patients were not generally consigned to institutions or hospitals. They continued to move around and socialize. So you saw people with disabilities who today would be corrected with cosmetic surgery or prosthetics, or would be behind the walls of an institution often. They were part of everyday life. So in Austen's lifetime, people did not necessarily expect cures, but rather tried to manage their ongoing discomfort. During extended periods of boredom, rehabilitation, and irritation, they used personalized caregiving practices, such as social visits, interesting readings, and pleasant meals. And one reason I love this painting is that it shows all of that. You can see the sufferer sitting in an armchair. You can see, once again, there's contact with her. It looks like maybe her mother is fluffing the pillow. Her father is sitting by her side. There's people on the outskirts. I'm not really sure what their role is, but there's obviously a sort of lady visitor reading the Bible or some kind of improving literature to her. But what you can also see on the side table, and I hope you can see this on the slide, is there's a bird cage with a bird to provide beautiful music. There's flowers for scent, and there's a bowl of fruit for taste. So every part of her experience is being treated. She's been given, interest, pleasure, sensory pleasure, company, in every way that she possibly can be. There's a blanket over her. This is how people cared. So the treatment for ordinary suffering was, in other words, leading a nicer, ordinary life. Disability and illness just formed part of ongoing life experience, naturally ebbing and flowing. And you'll remember in Persuasion, if you know Persuasion, that Anne Elliot, the main character, she periodically gets her bloom back. It just kind of comes and goes. But virtually everyone in Persuasion has some experience of being impaired by some condition: debility, injury, nervousness, depression, broken collarbone, brain damage, obesity, rheumatic fever, not necessarily in that order. Whereas today, we tend to assume that able-bodiedness is the norm and disability is a rare exception to that rule. In the early 19th century, the best that anyone could hope for was periodic remission or gradual improvement rather than a complete cure. In other words, in short, for medical cures, they substituted social alleviations. Now, I should explain that this was an ideal, and the reality often fell far short of it. It didn't always look like this Frith painting. Family and friends giving you your medical care or your social care is not always the best solution. You might not have that kind of social network in your life. People who love you might not be willing to administer an unpleasant treatment to you. Amateurs might have pretty patchy skills and not be very good at doing things they need to do. And any arrangement that depends on the voluntary participation of untrained folks is liable to fall apart. Moreover, in the 19th century, the burden of nursing fell disproportionately on women. Florence Nightingale very famously said that every woman in England is a nurse, but in our own text, Persuasion, Anne decrees that nursing does not belong to a man. It is not his province. So I want to make sure in this talk, it doesn't sound like I'm advocating going back in time to some idyllic, impossible, loving community. What I am is I'm interested in the literature that depicts these arrangements, but it doesn't mean I have to believe that they always worked. And I want us to remember as we go through this talk that real care communities often administered partial, idiosyncratic, and inept treatments that particularly exhausted and exploited women. So this talk, because it's about novels, is about a literary fantasy, the literary fantasy of care, not necessarily its more problematic lived reality. Why, you might ask, was care such a literary fantasy in the first place, though? Well, for one thing, it named an ongoing practice that could be narrativized. Next slide, please. So you may recognize, Austen people may recognize Mary Musgrove and Mr. Woodhouse. In Convalescence in the 19th century novel, Hosanna Krienke argues that, quote, many novels accumulate convalescent characters in order to initiate readers into a beneficial experience of tracking slow, fitful progress. The Victorian novels are big, progress is slow. The health kind of tracks that, and she talks about what she calls convalescent time of the novel. Another scholar, Erica Wright, has explained that 19th century subjects safeguarded their health through a continual labor of watchfulness and anxiety about diet and risks. So you may well think here of Mr. Woodhouse from Austen's Emma, with his gruel and his fear of drafts or of the wrong kind of food. Convalescence was, as Krienke writes, a condition of ongoing recovery and extended uncertainty. And as one physician explained, people were, quote, in an intermediate state, neither ill nor yet quite well. So as you can see on the images on the slide, while Mary Musgrove in Persuasion and Mr. Woodhouse anxiously regulate their lives, they have absolutely no hesitation in calling in a sister or daughter for help. So maintaining health was a constant activity, but it was also a family activity. Everybody was involved. This desire to call in help reveals another reason why illness was so good for plots. From a novelist's point of view, this kind of socially mediated chronic suffering is a gift because the need to provide that nursing means that characters have to move around. Next slide, please. Okay. For instance, Mary, this is all from Persuasion, Mary, often a little unwell and always thinking a great deal of her own complaints and always in the habit of claiming Anne when anything was the matter, was indisposed and entreated, or rather required her, for it was hardly entreaty, to come to Uppercross Cottage and bear her company as long as she should want her. Mary's demand for Anne sets Persuasion in motion. And for a lonely, marginalized, isolated person like Anne, the capacity to offer care is a way of feeling useful and beloved. Anne, glad to be thought of some use, readily agreed to stay. When Anne remarks later that, quote, a sick chamber may often furnish the worth of volumes, quote, it is true in a way she does not realize. A sick chamber can produce enough plot effects to fill a volume. By contrast, Jane Eyre's characters suffer acute crises that go well beyond their own capacity to manage, and they get very little help. Next slide, please. Okay, I feel like all my slides from Jane Eyre show people dying or collapsing, but that's kind of the way it is. But one thing you might notice immediately in these images is that there's much less contact. If you think back to the Frith, there's one person standing by watching the person who is suffering in each one of them. And I don't think that's coincidental. But if we go back to the beginning of Jane Eyre, you'll remember that Jane has a traumatic experience in the Red Room. And she says, That experience, quote, gave my nerves a shock of which I feel the reverberation to this day, end quote. Throughout the novel, we read her devastating experiences of semi-starvation at Lowood, her collapse near death at Marsh End. That's the black and white picture on the screen. We also see, just in a quick roundup, Helen's death from consumption, John Reed's suicide, Mrs. Reed's fatal stroke, that's on the left, that's the lady in the bed, and at the end of the novel, we foresee St. John's death in India. I should say that St. John is St. John, but this is British pronunciation, so as I tell my students, you have to pretend that it's pronounced Sinjin, St. John. The most extreme sufferer, however, is of course Bertha, who was imprisoned for 10 years without any treatment whatsoever. In Jane Eyre, you would think that these extreme conditions would generate some care, but none of them do. So just to take Mrs. Reed's deathbed, for instance, Mrs. Reed's daughters avoid that deathbed and, quote, the very servants paid her but a remittent attention. The hired nurse, being little looked after, would slip out of the room whenever she could, end quote. Later, Jane uneasily remembers the cold funeral with very few relatives, the silent church. This is not the way it's supposed to go. Mrs. Reed's solitary death reveals the horror of someone living and dying without a care community. In scenes like this, Bronte is not depicting the emergence of a superior medical system, but the catastrophe of the old social system dying out. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a slide where I put on way too many images, but I wanted to show you on the left in the new emerging medical model, there's a pattern here. There's one attendant who is gazing intensely at the patient. There's no physical contact. It's about expertise, measurement, deciding what to do. On the right, you have the older care model, which privileges touch, which literally centers the person who is suffering, which creates a community that is visually around that person. So I just thought, these 4 images, all of which we've looked at already, show you a really nice kind of contrast between different forms of care. Next slide, please. Okay, let's specifically compare 2 scenes when a child is suffering. Early in Persuasion, a boy named Charles Musgrove falls and dislocates his collarbone. And I put up a famous line about that. Anne takes over. Anne is his aunt. Anne had everything to do at once: the apothecary to send for, the father to have pursued and informed, the mother to support and keep from hysterics, the servants to control, the youngest child to banish, and the poor suffering one to attend and soothe. And I didn't put it in this quote, but she also calls the boy's grandparents and aunts in. So the child's fall reveals a few important points. First, as I've mentioned, the body was essentially a black box in the early 19th century. The family, quote, suspected great injury, but knew not where, unquote, until the apothecary's manual examination establishes the collarbone as the site of the problem. He does this by rubbing the boy's body, which I'm thinking, if you have a dislocated collarbone, it's got to be super painful. But anyway, that's how they figure it out, through manual manipulation. They're worried that there might have been a spinal injury, that the boy might be paralyzed. They have no way to figure this out except to wait and see. So this lack of knowledge of what's happening inside the body is quite alien to us in the era of X-rays and CAT scans. And one of the things that it means is that they didn't necessarily make the same distinction between illness and injury that we do today. So in the 19th century, what they could do is detect external symptoms. They could detect fever or pain or inflammation, but they didn't know what was causing it. Was it produced by a virus? Was it produced by an internal injury? There was no way to know. So one of the things you find out when you read 19th century novels is that distinguishing between disease and disability isn't always meaningful in a 19th century text. The second reason the child is interesting here is that we might notice, in that first quote especially, how Charles's fall functions to reorganize the group. It's like a magnet pulling disparate metal filings together. Before the fall, there had been a good deal of mutual irritation between the elder Musgroves of the Great House and the younger family at Uppercross Cottage. There were squabbles and resentments about perceived slights and self-aggrandizement. But the boy's fall immediately pulls everybody together into a care community. The crisis briefly pushes the Musgroves to achieve an intense communion, although, as you know, if you've read Persuasion, they soon lose interest and revert to squabbling once it turns out that the child is not in danger. Next slide, please. Thank you. In Jane Eyre, the child Jane has a crisis too, although hers is psychological and cognitive rather than a physical collapse. This is Jane after the Red Room incident when she has a species of fit. After this incident, she's clearly in a state that requires exactly the kind of loving attentiveness that a care community can provide. But the only people who make any attempt to give her that care are people whose attention is intermittent at best, maybe even hostile. The servant Bessie is probably the best of them. She's uneasily aware of Jane's needs, remarking in the first line that, is it the first line? Maybe it's a later line. Yeah, the second quote, that Mrs. was rather too hard, and telling her fellow servant in the top quote that poor Miss Jane is to be pitied too. But you can see in the quote that her fellow servant retorts that the problem is Jane is too ugly to care about her. Bessie also tries to provide the kind of care that we've seen. You remember the flowers, the fruit. She brings a circlet of pastry, a delicate pastry on Jane's favorite painted plate. So she's aware of what needs to happen in a care community. And this attention does bring Jane some comfort. But then it's over. Bessie leaves, remarking that she doesn't want to be alone with Jane in case Jane dies. That's the middle quote, which Jane overhears. The apothecary's visit also offers Jane some temporary emotional relief. As Jane remembers, I felt so sheltered and befriended while he sat in the chair near my pillow. But as he closed the door after him, all the room darkened and my heart again sank. Nobody else comes to help. Jane lies awake all night, quote, in ghastly wakefulness, unquote, full of dread. Now that's a scene that would never occur in Austen. Uppercross Cottage and the Great House are absolutely full of family, sometimes too full. But at Gateshead, care is provided by indifferent paid employees, people who have no emotional investment in the sufferer and who are mainly concerned to limit their own labor. Jane desperately wants a care community, and Bessie knows that she needs to provide one, but this novel shows a world in which that can no longer be taken for granted. Next slide, please. Okay, The Fall. Those of you who know Persuasion know what this was all leading up to, right? In both novels, our heroine has a romantic rival, somebody that the man she loves has been involved with before, and in both cases, that rival, that other woman, suffers a catastrophic fall. So you all know that at the center of Persuasion is Louisa's fall. But a woman falls in Jane Eyre as well, Bertha Mason, who springs from the battlements of Thornfield. Both women smash against the hard pavement. And in each case, the fall marks the acme of the novel's depiction of care. In Louisa's case, her fall consolidates and deepens care communities. Her catastrophe generates a social network whose emotional dynamics shape the rest of the novel. But in Bertha's case, the fall is the climax of a decade of what we might call carelessness with a vengeance. It acts like a punctuation mark that works to emphasize the horrors of what came before. So let's do Louisa first. The quote is on the slide. He advised against her. He advised her against it. She wants to jump into his arms. Thought the jar too great, but no. He reasoned and talked in vain. She smiled and said, I am determined I will. He put out his hands. She was too precipitate by half a second. She fell on the pavement on the lower cob and was taken up lifeless. Whew. What Anne does almost immediately is to start assembling a community of care. Just as in her nephew's case, she knows exactly what to do and whom to reach out to, as Wentworth justly agrees. No one so proper, so capable as Anne. That's a quote from Persuasion. She's just really, really good at care community management. Louisa's carers are quite diverse, including her family, her parents, brother, sister, and those siblings' connections, Charles Hayter, Anne Elliot, Mary Musgrove, plus Captain Wentworth. But you might remember that it also includes virtual strangers, Captain Benwick and the Harvilles, and it includes the Crofts, who are concerned but not directly involved connections. It even includes working-class subjects, including the Musgroves' old nursery maid Sarah, and the unnamed workmen who carry Louisa and Henrietta to the house. Part of the thrill here is how the urgent need for immediate care bonds people who have little in common and who never knew each other before. We might know, too, who is not in Louisa's care community: medical professionals. There's no doctor or apothecary in this group. Only one member is presumably paid, the old nurse, but her affiliation is explicitly presented as motivated by affection rather than salary. Apparently, the nurse has been just hanging out waiting for somebody to get sick so that she can go and nurse them. Anne has called in the apothecary for her nephew, and the surgeon does get called for Louisa, but their judgments just get paraphrased briefly by more important characters and they disappear from the narrative. They're not part of the ongoing care in any way that sort of matters to the readers of the novel. Louisa's care community works well in other respects. In a viable community of care, care is extended to everyone. And that means that you might join a care community because somebody's in need, like Louisa here. But once the care community develops, you try to meet each other's needs. It's not just focused on the original person whose crisis precipitated its formation. Louisa's care community is exemplary in this respect. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to read well, I guess I'll read the whole thing because it's so great. It's just such a role model for how to give care. Mrs. Musgrove had got Mrs. Harville's children away as much as she could. Every possible supply from Uppercross had been furnished to lighten the inconvenience to the Harvilles, while the Harvilles had been wanting them to come to dinner every day. And in short, it seemed to have been only a struggle on each side as to which should be most disinterested and hospitable. So they're all giving care to each other. The carers care for each other. Good care communities need to be fluid and voluntary too, as members move in and out of the circle, negotiating, for instance, who should stay, whether it should be Mary or Anne. Remember too, from that earlier slide, that I stressed that care is an action, not a feeling. So it isn't necessary that a care community's members should all like each other or even like the person they are tending, as long as they do the work of care, which is the work of meeting a need. So for instance, it's clear that everyone finds Mary super annoying, but they're all still going to humor her and meet her needs. But the experience of giving care generally does produce the feeling of caring. And as Mary says here, we love her the better for having nursed her. Indeed, I argue in my book that care is kind of the stem cell of good feeling in many 19th century novels, and that includes Persuasion. Whenever you need to generate good feeling between people, create suffering, create an injury or a disease, and it creates those bonds. Wendy Jones has discussed how important tenderness is to relationships in Austen, and I think tenderness really is the perfect word. A person in need produces loving feelings in everyone around her, not just for her, but for each other. Next PowerPoint. Next slide, please. Captain Wentworth knows this truth. Early on, he fondly recalls his first ship, his worn-out ship, not in spite of, but because of her poor condition. He says, she was a dear old Asp to me. Asp is the name of the ship. She did all that I wanted. I knew she would. The affection he feels for this, quote, quite worn out and broken up ship, hardly fit for service, end quote, prefigures his tenderness to Anne's weary body. The most romantic scenes in the novel occur when Anne is tired with walking or plagued by a noisy child on her back. That's the image here. And Wentworth quietly assists her. Quote, she was in the carriage and felt that he had placed her there, that his will and his hands had done it, that she owed it to his perception of her fatigue and his resolution to give her rest. End quote. When Louisa falls, Wentworth, of course, participates in her community of care, partly out of his sense of responsibility for the catastrophe, and partly because caring really is fundamental to his character. But in Jane Eyre, Bertha's fall is quite different, partly because in this case, the man who caused it has no sense of responsibility for it or interest in reparative labor. Next slide, please. So in my discussion of this, I'm drawing heavily on Chris Gabbard's important account called From Custodial Care to Caring Labor in the collection The Mad Woman and the Blind Man. That's the bottom of this slide. Gabbard notes that Rochester draws from a discourse of freaks, monsters, and demons when he describes his wife, and that his disgust is, quote, reflected in the type of care he arranges for her. His normative framework of caregiving is an inherently dichotomous, asymmetrical, custodial one, in which Bertha is, or in his view should be, the passive recipient of care, while Rochester, or that's an end quote, while Rochester retains all the power and all the control. In other words, Bertha's like an inert object that he controls and stows places and, just does everything to. This arrangement obviously violates the communal, reciprocal, fluid composition of care communities, and in the 1840s, it also contradicted the new work of reforming treatments for the mentally ill by providing humane asylums. So the 1840s, as Gabbard points out, was a time of reform when that's what everybody was doing. They were, creating nicer asylums. So Gabbard points out that for Bronte's readers, Rochester's treatment would have seemed really dangerously outmoded. And it's from this perspective that Jane expresses shock at Rochester's treatment in the top quote here, telling him, quote, "You are inexorable for that unfortunate lady. You speak of her with hate, with vindictive antipathy. It is cruel. She cannot help being mad," end quote. Jane's pity, however, does not help Bertha. Early 19th century marriage law gave Rochester complete control over his wife, enabling him to transport her from the Caribbean to England. She's kept in the hold, which I think, tells you something about how he sees her as an object. And then he imprisons her on the 3rd floor of Thornfield Hall with a woman who makes no attempt to care for her. Kept isolated without fresh air or change or treatment, treated as a non-human burden, Bertha's condition can't do anything but deteriorate profoundly. So Bertha's leap is suicidal, or I think it's also homicidal, because I suspect that it's also an attempt to lure Rochester up to the flaming roof and thus into danger. When Louisa leaps, she expects someone to be there to catch her. When Bertha leaps, she jumps from one isolation to another, from a slow violence to a quick death. Her only respite, a second or two of freedom in between the two unbearable states. Next slide, please. Okay. Part 4, The Invalid. At the end of both novels, our heroine loves someone who has a significant visible disability that is not going to be cured. In Persuasion, critics have sometimes questioned why the non-mobile Mrs. Smith is in the novel at all. And I've given you Sir Walter Anne's father's full expostulation here, but, I can just read a line of it. Sir Walter sputters, "A mere Miss Smith, an everyday Mrs. Smith, of all people and all names in the world, to be the chosen friend of Miss Anne Elliot." Yet it is Mrs. Smith's commonness, as signaled by her name, that marks a new expansion of care community work. The laborers, nurses, and sick people with whom Mrs. Smith communicates compose an alternative, interconnected, networked version of Bath, of the city in which she lives. The care community reaches its widest extent here. From her space in that little room, Mrs. Smith sees, connects to, learns about, hears about the whole city through this whole network of laundresses and nurses and other people whom people like Sir Walter never even notice. If suffering produces good feelings in caregivers, as I've been arguing today, then surely Mrs. Smith is the best candidate for friendship we have seen yet. She is, after all, as the bottom quote says, "a poor, infirm, helpless widow," end quote. Nobody ever seems to think of calling a doctor for Mrs. Smith. She has a nurse, Nurse Rook, but we never hear about Nurse Rook's medical ministrations, if there are any, only about her usefulness as a friend and confidant. Next slide, please. Okay. Significantly, Mrs. Smith is not cured. The improvement in her health at the end of the novel is simply due to having a better ordinary life, a more varied diet and interests, and to the loving care of friends. And it's the friends' loving care, of course, that makes everything else possible. It's the friends' loving care that provides the food and the varied interests. Having a chronically disabled person like Mrs. Smith in the novel means that care relations must persist beyond the end of the story, guaranteeing the ongoing kindness that Austen's readers associated with such relationships. And that matters. Mrs. Smith's capacity to be an ongoing source of good feeling is all the more important because she counts as Anne's modest contribution to the couple's shared social network. You might remember when Anne first meets the Benwicks and Captain Harville, she thinks, oh, these could all have been my friends. So she's kind of jealous of, kind of coveting Captain Wentworth's social network. But once they decide to get married, Anne thinks sadly she had, quote, no relations to bestow on him which a man of sense could value. And, quote, she had but two friends in the world to add to his list, Lady Russell and Mrs. Smith. And since Lady Russell stopped them from getting married in the first place, Captain Wentworth is not a fan. So it's really kind of just Mrs. Smith. But that means that Mrs. Smith's capacity to generate good feeling really, really matters. The care community that this novel builds is so palpable that it appears to actually narrate the novel's last lines. And I should say I'm sort of drawing on the two quotes at the top of this slide here. We learn that Anne, quote, was tenderness itself, unquote. And it was only his dangerous profession that, quote, could ever make her friends wish that tenderness less, quote. It's focalized through the friends. We see her married life through a haze of friends' good wishes. But I'm not going to discuss this, but I put this on the PowerPoint just to note this, the difference between the ending of the two novels. In Persuasion, the last thing we're assured of is that Mrs. Smith and Anne and Wentworth have friends. The friends matter. But St. John's death is alone. He's unmarried. He himself has sufficed, right? A stranger will write to me next. There will never be any relief for St. John. He will always be alone. But I'm not going to talk about St. John. The chronic invalid at the end of Jane Eyre is Rochester, and Rochester could not be any more different from Mrs. Smith. Whereas Mrs. Smith turns her disability into a city-wide social network, Rochester uses his disability to isolate completely. He's lost his right hand and right eye, action in his left eye that blinds him. So this is his disability, and he demands to be left alone at Ferndean, a dark, desolate, overgrown place that is, quote, uninhabited and unfurnished, unquote. There are two servants there, but Rochester rebuffs their attempts at care, ordering them back to the house when they try to help and refusing all social visits. His isolation is so total and so damaging that when Jane enters, he has trouble believing that she is real. He thinks he's been kind of hallucinating, and he thinks she's a hallucination. The way Jane Eyre, the novel, solves this problem is through marriage. The wide friend network these two characters should have had all their lives gets compressed and condensed into a single person who can be all in all to each other. As Jane says, quote, I will be your neighbor, your nurse, your housekeeper, quote. And that's lovely, but it occurs to me it might have been better to have had neighbors, nurses, and housekeepers all along. As Rochester plaintively points out, all that's very well, but, quote, I want a wife, unquote. Never fear, Jane redefines wifehood as a care relation. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm just going to single out a few lines on this long quotation about how his disability provokes a beautiful care connection. I was his vision as I am still his right hand. There was a pleasure in my services, most full, most exquisite, even though sad, because he claimed those services without shame. He loved me so truly that he knew no reluctance in profiting by my attendance. And on the other hand, he felt I loved him so fondly that to yield that attendance was to indulge my sweetest wishes. The perfect meeting of a carer and a cared for, somebody who loves to give care, somebody who loves to take the care. But in the context in which we're reading it today, what we're noticing here is that for the first time, Rochester discovers that voluntary care feels better than paid care. As he says in the second quote, henceforth I have hated to be helped, to be led. Henceforth I feel I shall hate it no more. I did not like to put my hand into a hireling's, but it is pleasant to feel it circled by Jane's little fingers. I preferred utter loneliness to the constant attendance of servants, but Jane's soft ministry will be a perpetual joy. It takes the whole novel for Rochester to discover that care means someone who wants to meet your needs, caring labor, not custodial care, not a custodial burden. Of course, if they were in an Austen novel, they could have had that from the beginning. In Austen's world, Characters simply take it for granted that loving care is generally desirable and should be provided by people nearby. But in Bronte's novel, it is a hard-won, long-awaited conclusion wrought out of devastating, destructive years without care, or with minimal attendance that is carelessly given by alienated servants and indifferent medical men. St. John never gets it at all, nor even knows enough to want it. And this is where, it's at its best in Jane Eyre, because by the time you get to Villette, as I argue in my book, there's basically no possibility of that kind of care relation anymore at all. We're in a world of entirely paid care, the medical model. But in Jane Eyre, Jane's and Rochester's great achievement is a marriage that is a perfect care relation, made possible by what I would want to call his fortunate disability. And the intense bliss and relief of that marriage is, in part, because it concentrates all the feeling that ought to have been spread over many people over their whole lifetimes. Secluded and unhealthy Ferndean, they become everything to each other. The care community was beginning to disappear at mid-century, but it was Bronte's brilliance to realize that a different version of it might be reconstituted through the marriage plot. So I just called Rochester's condition a fortunate disability. And I think we have Mrs. Smith and Rochester's condition at the end as the novel's promise that care will go on. No cure is possible, or maybe even desired for either of them. Loving care does produce some improvement. When Rochester recovers some sight in his surviving eye, they visit a doctor, but the doctor's job is to corroborate, yes, you are seeing a little bit in that eye. Yes, that eye is improving. The doctor doesn't do anything to make the eye better. The improvement has happened before they go to the doctor. So medicine doesn't help, but loving relationships do. Rochester gets partial recovery of some vision. Mrs. Smith gets a general improvement in health. Those things testify that care works, but it stops short of curing them completely because that would risk altering the good feelings arising out of their disabilities. Next slide, please. I'm almost done. Okay. As you can tell by the fact that it says conclusion. Reading Persuasion and Jane Eyre together shows us how care communities worked in the 19th century imagination and how bitterly regretted and passionately valued they were as they began to slip away. It is easy today for us to see how amateur care could go very, very wrong. It is easy today to be grateful for medical advances, for the possibility of cures for conditions that would have been debilitating or fatal in the 19th century. We who read these novels, we are spared much of the suffering we read about. Many of us on this talk today can be present and attentive because we have benefited from just that kind of medical care. But in focusing on scientific cure, we have also perhaps underestimated the psychological value of mutual care. And this is a very timely thought, I think. The pandemic has taught us the costs of isolation, like St. John, and the digital realm has shown us what it is like when you have only mediated virtual social contact. Care means meeting another's need, and care communities can do that for us. And in my book, I argue that care communities exist all around us in teams, in clubs, even in classrooms. We're all enmeshed in groups like that. Many of us are here today for this talk because we are especially drawn to 19th century fictions. And I think our pleasure comes in some part from enjoying the rich social worlds that these novels depict, the relationships on page or screen among loving, squabbling, mutually helpful people in a community, or a marriage that constitutes a perfectly suited exemplary care relationship. And perhaps it is a wise move to imagine ourselves into a culture in which social ties could form through care, in which disability was accepted as commonplace instead of stigmatized as abnormal, and in which people felt compelled to relieve others' suffering instead of awaiting professional interventions. I think there is something we can take away from these two novels, and that is an awareness that periods of suffering are to be expected in every life, and that loving ministrations can help other people endure them. In this respect, Persuasion and Jane Eyre show us models of humane, accommodating, loving care. Perhaps we can value not only the care that Jane and Anne give other characters, but the way their novels, Persuasion and Jane Eyre, give care to us too. Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you so much, Talia, for that talk. That was splendid. Really appreciate that. If you're in the audience, please post your questions. Send your questions into the comments, or you can email us at info@janeaustenandco.org. We've already got one audience question, so I thought we might start there. So I'm going to show this. Hopefully, there we go. Okay, so this is from Kira Sanskrant. Do you think Bronte intended to contrast Jane's care for Rochester to Rochester's care for Bertha?
Yeah, interesting question. Yeah, people who write about this tend to think that what happens is Jane sees Rochester's care for Bertha, says that, this is awful in that line that I cited, but she doesn't do anything about it. And what has to happen is she has to go meet the Rivers family and get cared for herself. She has to learn how care ought to work. She's never seen that in her life, right? She's never gotten good care. Doesn't get good care at Thornfield, doesn't get good care at Lowood. But when she goes to the Rivers, she's near death. And they take care of her and she observes it. And in fact, at one point she says to them, she differentiates between, I think it's St. John's Evangelical Charity and Diana and Mary, the sisters' kind of loving, genuine care. She makes some distinction like that. And so it's only when she learns that she can then go back and take care of Rochester properly. So I think it is a contrast, but it's also a transition. It's also a kind of character arc for Jane, that she learns not just to condemn bad care, but how to actually provide good care.
Thank you. All right. As we await for more questions to come in, Talia, I have a question for you, and Deb, you want to follow up after that with a question?
Sure.
Okay, so I've been working on a project about institutional identities in 19th century fiction, and I've been thinking about like Lowood Institution as one of those institutions. And it strikes me that like an educational institution like Lowood should be a community of care for those girls that attend that school. And ostensibly, like that's part of their identity. Like when Jane first sees the school, she sees the Bible verse above the doorway that's like Matthew 5 something. It says like, let your light shine forth, blah, 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 blah. And then as she's reading that sign, she hears, I believe it's Helen Burns coughing. Like she hears like a faint cough simultaneously. And so there's like this already kind of a critique of this place. And I guess like your version of like communities of care, it's familial, it's friendships. Do institutions like play any role in like, I guess, positive role in being communities of care?
Oh, I love that question. I don't know if you've read Hosanna Krienke's book on convalescence, but that would be so great for answering this question, because Krienke is talking about convalescent homes, which is, and one of the arguments I think she's really making there is that we need to bring these things back. This was great. Instead of being kicked out of the hospital after 3 days or whatever, you went to a convalescent home, which looked like, it was made to look like a private home, and you got to sort of lie around in the parlor and, get meals delivered to you and just take your time recuperating in an environment in which people were helping you. And so I'm teaching Bleak House right now, and if those of you who know Bleak House, there's this amazing building which is Mr. George's shooting gallery. It's literally a shooting gallery. It is not a place you would expect to be an institution that would offer care, and it becomes a convalescent home. All the kind of lonely men in the novel creep there to die. So things can turn into institutions in the convalescent home way. But I would say, Miss Temple is obviously the only person at Lowood who tries to treat it like a community of care. But in my book, one of the things I ask is, should a school be a care community? And I'm addressing this to readers who I'm assuming are in academia in one way or another, but anybody who has taught or been in a classroom could think about this. So in some ways, yes, as you pointed out absolutely correctly, yes, we want schools to be communities of care. That seems like an obvious natural thing. In another way, they actually aren't really fit for that because they have an external imperative. They're there to teach you something. They're not necessarily there to meet your emotional or physical needs. And so if a school turns to trying to make everybody feel good all the time, then everybody gets A's and, nobody learns anything. And maybe everybody should get A's anyway, but, nobody's going to learn anything. Care is not always pleasant. Sometimes, you have to like double down on things. And the other thing about care is that it has to be egalitarian in the sense that everybody within the care community is worth respect and attention. And a classroom or a school is definitely not an egalitarian space. There are people in charge. There are people who are, have to obey them. And so if you eradicate that, it feels like bad faith a lot of the time. So long answer, but it was a really interesting question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, somebody has said in the chat that boarding schools were a different setup. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of the things I would just add to that is what I say in the book, this is in the epilogue of Communities of Care, is that what you tend to get are like the students could form a community of care within themselves. And if say that you have like TAs, the TAs could be another community of care because they're egalitarian. And say it's co-taught by a couple of professors, they might be a community of care. So that might be happening in a boarding school as well. You get different groups forming their own internal communities.
Mm-hmm.
So here's a question. I understand. Oh, it just disappeared.
I see it.
Can you see that, Eric? Because it just disappeared for me.
I think I got it displayed. Oh.
Yeah, I understand the emergence of doctors' care alters the 1840s landscape. Can part of the difference between Louisa and Bertha's situation be because of Bertha's madness, violence, and cruelty?
That makes me wonder about something. In Jane Eyre, when Rochester is telling Jane about Bertha's diagnosis, he says, and it's a parenthetical remark, since the medical man had pronounced her mad, she had, of course, been shut up. And I mean, I find it very interesting that that's parenthetical. And also, she wasn't doing anything particularly mad. When we do a close reading of that scene, whenever I teach Jane Eyre, her faults had been that she gets drunk and she sleeps around, basically. But those are not things that are necessarily signs of insanity. So I'm going a little ways back in Jane Eyre to answer this question, because I think the question is, what made her mad, violent, and cruel? And I think the answer is being locked up for 10 years in a strange country with nobody to care for her. So it's not like Bertha comes to the table like this. It's Rochester has tortured her into this. And, I'm not even getting into the whole, reading of Bertha, which I think is absolutely accurate as a racialized figure. But I think I really want to accord Bertha humanity and status. And I really want to say, if she is mad and violent and cruel, she has every reason to be, and she has no choice in the matter. And I mean, if I were Bertha, I would want to go and burn down Rochester's bed as well, honestly. But I think if there had been a real doctor who had really treated her, and not just a medical man who wanted to flatter the rich white guy who wanted to get rid of his wife, which is how I read that. The medical man had pronounced her mad. Then I don't think she would have been in the same condition. And so I don't think there would have been as big a difference between Louisa and Bertha.
Thank you. Another audience question. Let's get this displayed. Any thoughts, switching novels, any thoughts on the significance of the doctor in Sense and Sensibility during Marianne's illness? Thinking about how the infections, the fever necessitates most of the people in the house to be sent away. So that is interesting about fever and the lack of community if somebody is contagious. How do you think that factors into your theory here?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the doctor in Sense and Sensibility. Maybe somebody who's read it more recently than me can remind me. Is the doctor very prominent? I mean, there's certainly a care community, right, with Eleanor and the mother nursing her, and even what's her name? The woman who takes him in the coach, the sort of heavy woman, the fatter woman that Marianne is very cruel to, ends up being very caring.
Yeah, Mrs. Jennings.
Thank you, Mrs. Jennings. Yeah. You can see I haven't read this in a little while. Yeah, so Mrs. Jennings ends up being part of the care community. Everybody kind of pitches in. So Deb, do you remember the doctor particularly?
Yeah, they bring a doctor in, and he's the one that says everybody has to leave because it's an infectious fever. And that's when they're at, I can't remember, is it Cleveland? They're at their other house. They were on their way home.
Mhm.
and they call in a doctor. So that is, you know, I want to say Hugh Laurie, but you know who I mean. It's
Yes. Thank you for reminding me, because I was thinking of Marianne and her depression, and I was going to answer it about the depression, but you're absolutely right. She contracts like a putrid fever or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And the doctor does diagnose this, and everybody has to quarantine. Thank you for reminding me of that. I think that is a great example of how illness makes people move around, makes things happen in novels. And I love that example because it creates care communities, and the people who are quarantined. And I remember the people who are quarantined, who are like kicked out of their own home and who are surprisingly like good natured about it, in a way that, you know, the other characters point out, like they're really nice about this, you know? So the emphasis is still on the good feeling, but it does take, in this case, it does take the doctor to exile them or to move them around. And I should just say, I don't mean that doctors didn't exist before the mid 19th century. People do call in doctors all the time, but doctors tend to be treated as neighbors. They're like people you know, people you can trust. And then when somebody gets sick and the doctor fails to cure it or fails to diagnose it properly, it's seen as a betrayal by your friend. So I can think of, you know, there's a lot of examples of this. You might think about Middlemarch, which, although it's published in 1872, is set in the 1830s. And when Fred Vincy falls ill, I think he's typhus. It's either typhus or typhoid. I can't remember. But their usual doctor doesn't diagnose it properly, and they call in Lydgate. And they say to that doctor, "Oh, but you've had dinner with us. Like, how could you fail to diagnose this?" You know, it's a social failing. Again, medicine is a social activity. So that's where the doctor is. And the doctor, if you think about Trollope's Dr. Thorne, or if you think about the doctor and Miss Marchbanks, they're next door neighbors. They're part of the marriage plot. That's kind of their function.
Here's another. Can you put this one up? It makes me think in Jane Eyre of how Jane foresees a future of early demise for herself in India as St. St. helpmate, as he did not have the temperament, love, or kindness to provide, there's more of a question, care she would need in the case of ill health in a tropical clime. By Rochester's voice bringing her back, she rejects his future demise and prescience of a clinical form of care.
And it goes on. There's one more part of the question.
There is, yes. And instead, here we go, turns to a wholehearted Austen era notion of care. Yeah.
Love this.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Nothing's better for me when I give a talk to see people start doing care readings in the comments. This is like what I'm living for. This is great. That's a beautiful reading. Although I think St. John is even meaner than this. It's not just that, let me look at it again. It's not just that he did not have the temperament, love, or kindness to provide the care. It's that he would say, well, your body should be, you know, a sacrifice to your Lord. You know, your body should be debased. And like, if you die, so what? You know, you've done God's bidding. So I think he would just be fine with her dying. Yeah. But yes, otherwise, yes, absolutely.
All right, here is a question. Or Deb, did you have a follow-up to that, or?
No, I was just going to do the next one. You go ahead.
Okay, cool. This is from Kylie.
Yeah.
Do you think Mary Musgrove's hypochondria is an attempt to build community around herself and bring her family together, or something more self-serving? On a similar note, I know you mentioned Mr. Woodhouse, who clearly worries about his daughters leaving him and probably also has hypochondria. Do you feel he expresses more worry over perceived illness to keep them close?
Yes, good. Another beautiful care reading. Absolutely. Yeah. Mr. Woodhouse's anxieties are there to get attention for him, to keep his care community around him. He can say, like, there are only two people, I think it's Mrs. Goddard and I forget the other one who he likes to have for dinner. Oh, Mrs. Bates. And that's it. He doesn't have to deal with any other guests because, you know, those are the only ones he's comfortable with, and people have to pay attention to him. People have to care for him. I also think that Mrs. Bennet's nerves, her infamous nerves in Pride and Prejudice, are a way of expressing anxiety, you know, that she comes from a lower class than her husband and she has to manage this family and this household. And I think the nerves are a way of saying, I can't deal with this. I think the body speaks in a lot of Austen novels. It speaks the things that women can't say. Lady Bertram, I know I'm giving you many more examples of hypochondriacal people in Austen. Lady Bertram is so apathetic in Mansfield Park. also, I think, as an expression of her inability to manage an estate that she is at least 3,000 pounds, short of deserving. But I want to direct everybody who's interested in this question to an article recently published in a novel by Christian Lewis, which gives a different reading of hypochondria than the one we have today, and which has really shaped my thinking on this. And Lewis argues that hypochondria isn't pretending that you're ill, it's being in this liminal state, sort of performing, oscillating, and uses performance theory to think about sickness and health in Austen. So specifically in Austen.
Speaking of hypochondria, of course, Sanditon, that's what the whole book is about, really. And you have not only a care community of friends and family, but you also have your medical model that the whole town is set up. And of course, we don't know how she would have played it all out, but the hypochondria there is, and I think that Mrs. Austen was quite the hypochondriac herself, was she not? Yeah. And I think this is why it shows up in so much of Austen. I love this because I feel this way myself. This kind of breaks my heart looking at it from this perspective because I love Rochester. It is a problem. Yes.
I love Rochester too, and I think I've gone through lots of stages in my thinking about Rochester, honestly. I used to, of course, when I first read Jane Eyre and I was, 13 or whatever, we all know, right? The romantic hero. Yeah. And then I went through a period of, he's sexually harassing Jane and like, this cannot stand. And then I went, and now where I'm landing right now is that this is a guy who's in some ways victimized by his patriarchal upbringing. He knows that the way he behaves is wrong. He doesn't know what to do about it. And so you see when he meets Jane, he's just like, I apologize. I know I commanded you. I'm not supposed to do that. I keep forgetting how to be polite. But even things like the scene where he dresses as a Roma woman to try to elucidate how Jane feels about him. I mean, I used to read that as a horrific betrayal, like unspeakable. But now I sort of think how nice that he wants to know what Jane thinks. Not every mid-19th century or early 19th century man was interested. I mean, she's at his mercy. And he keeps saying, I could use violence, but I won't. It's not a lot of credit to give him, but it means something that he respects Jane as an agent and a thinker and a person with her own feelings, and he wants to know what those feelings are, and he wants to respect them, and he doesn't know how. I can just say something quickly about Sanditon before we go on. Yeah. I have so many thoughts about Sanditon, but I'll just say one thing about Sanditon, which is I think like the whole dynamic that I talked about today is encapsulated in the fact that in the opening scene, he's in a carriage driving to try to find a doctor, and the carriage overturns and he's taken in by a family. Mm-hmm. So he's on his way to a medical authority and he gets diverted into a care community where they can dress his sprained ankle and give him everything he needs. And that's kind of like exactly what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Before we get to our next question, Talia, we've had a couple of folks want that title of that article just to make sure it's A Malady of Interpretation by Christian Lewis.
Yes, that's the one. And thank you for looking that up.
We're going to get a link to that article posted. And so you can click that and that'll take you to the article.
You will not be disappointed. Yeah. Okay.
Another question from the audience. Let's see. This is from Nora Quinlan. Could we talk about institutionalizing of care as it developed in the 19th century? Hospitals, poorhouses, mental health institutions, which we've kind of been doing the past couple minutes as well. But I'm wondering, Talia, if there's more to add on to that discussion and more food for thought from another audience member is Jane Austen's brother, who was institutionalized for life, George. Yeah. So I'm wondering if there's like more to be said on that like institutionalization aspect of communal care.
Well, now that I know that you work on, I would ask you that question about institutionalization. I know, is that part of your work on institutions?
Kind of. I'm thinking about like educational institutions as like what their outward sign is and whether that kind of is contradicted in how they embody their practice, but not necessarily the health side of that.
Yeah.
I don't think George was institutionalized in the sense of what we think of today. He was put in a home of a family, and they took care of him for life. So they created their own community of care, essentially, and paid for it. And because they were unable themselves to take care of him. We really don't know much about it, do we? Other than the dates, we know when he died, and that he was taken care of till the end of his life by the Austins.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Yeah, it was a farm family, I think. And we don't know if Jane visited George, but Emily Standback at University of Southern Mississippi is working on George, and I'm eager to see what she's going to find. She's given some conference papers on it. So
that's interesting.
Yeah.
There is a thought that he was deaf, because there's some thinking that Jane Austen knew sign language.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting clue.
Yeah, she says like she did use finger spelling or something, or she signed with somebody in some of her letters. So that could be it. Yeah. And there's a book by Jennifer Esmail on deafness in the 19th century that points out that people who were born deaf were often considered to be cognitively impaired because without hearing people speak, they couldn't communicate themselves. They couldn't learn how to make those sounds themselves. And so when they were denied language, that was perceived as aligning them with animals or a barbaric kind of sound. So if he was deaf, that we don't know if he's cognitively disabled, cognitively impaired, or deaf, or what was happening. But absolutely, it's a really interesting question.
Yeah. Let's see.
Okay.
A lot of people saying great talk, and it certainly was. It is fabulous. It makes us think about so many different things. You think about the times of the novels that we're talking about, but I think about even our care communities today. Anybody I know that they're injured, they have surgery, and people come out of the woodwork bringing food, and so we still have these very active care communities in our lives.
Absolutely. And,
it's just so nice to see you coming at these novels from that point of view. It's not what we tend to pull out ourselves. So it's fabulous. Oh, there's the link to the article.
Good.
Did you show that already, Eric?
We posted the article, and here it is displayed. And you can copy and paste that link. That's in the comments section.
And people who are watching this on YouTube later, will this all turn up for them? Will the comments?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Okay. Good. So I think we had a question. Oh, okay, good.
We had one about Jane Eyre again. I do love the redemption at the end of Jane Eyre. So.
I think we had a question about social class affecting access to care.
Oops. Sorry, that's my fault. There we go.
Yes. Yeah. So really big question. And I think it's a really great one because it shows you that the people who are wealthier, like the Reeds and Jane Eyre, are not necessarily getting good care because they can afford to hire carers and they don't necessarily pursue their own personal relationships. So Miriam Balin has a book called The Sick Room in Victorian Fiction. I think it's Victorian Fiction. Anyway, by Miriam Balin, which is Bailin. And one of which has been like really foundational for my thinking. And one of the things that Balin points out is that amateur caregivers are almost always good and paid caregivers are almost always bad in the 19th century. Anyway, because I think partly because they're validating the idea of a voluntary care community. So in a way, the Reeds' wealth disadvantages them. They never learn how to give care. Whereas the Riverses, because they're poorer, they have this one servant who's really like a part of the family, and it's probably based on the servant that the Brontes had, who was really like a part of the family, and they are the ones who have the care relations. And in Persuasion, when I write about persuasion in communities of care, one of the things I argue is that Anne is the master of the care communities. As I said, she's really good at assembling them. But the Elliots have a very different social model, which is how the novel opens, the baronetage, the hierarchical elite form of society. And when they're in Bath and they want to see the Honorable Mrs. Devereux, is it?
Dalrymple.
Dalrymple, thank you.
Dalrymple, yeah.
Yes. And Anne is like, why? She has nothing to recommend her, you know. So it's a very different model of society that is being contrasted to Anne's care communities.
More compliments are coming in.
Yes.
Julie Sweeten, excellent, interesting talk, thought-provoking, and so well presented.
Thank you.
Here's an interesting one.
Yes.
Family members get a stipend for providing home care to their ill loved one.
Yeah, I think wasn't there a proposal to do that in this country? And wouldn't that be nice, right?
When you think about the number of caregivers, yeah.
Yeah.
I had a question about Mr. Perry.
Yes.
In Emma, because he's obviously the apothecary, really, and yet he's part of that care community. He's also the major gossip in Emma. He knows everything. So it's sort of not everything he learns, he's passing on. He's not very, what could we say about Mr. Perry?
Well, what's so interesting is when we're thinking about him, we're thinking about his social function, whether he's going to set up a carriage, whether he recommends going to the seashore, whether he recommends cake, you know. But these are not necessarily, we don't hear it from Mr. Perry himself as medical pronouncements. These are part of the social fabric of life, you know, in the town and in the way that people talk to each other. Again, the medical men before the mid-19th century are members of a society. They're treasured friends, or they're ex-friends, as in the case of Middlemarch, who failed to diagnose things properly. But their medical function is not important. And so we see that with Nurse Rook at the end of Persuasion. Does she have a medical function? I guess, maybe, but, you know, it's not that important. We just got a whole bunch more questions here, didn't we?
Yeah.
Sure did.
You want to grab that one, Eric?
Yeah, we'll start with Mary McCauley's question. So she asks, or starts with a statement. To my understanding, part of the role of upper-class women with leisure was to perform Christian acts of charity like giving food, sewing for poor neighbors, etc. Would this fall within your conception of a community of care, or is this something else? Was your community only within your social class?
Yeah, so interesting. There's a book on philanthropy called, I think, The Angel Out of the House by Doris Williams Elliot, and who talks about that philanthropy. I was trying, the images that I chose for this talk show that with the, you know, the image of the lady visitor who's sitting by this bedside, you know, in that one painting, who's reading the Bible or something. That's an example of a philanthropic visitor. It could be part of a community of care if it's done right, and often it was not done right. So again, I'm thinking about Bleak House because I'm teaching it now, and because everybody is disabled in Bleak House. It's an interesting novel for these things. So Esther does it right. She participates in a respectful way. She respects the people that she's helping. She helps them as, you know, fellow members of the human race, basically, and she forges a personal tie. But Esther watches both Mrs. Jellyby and Mrs. Particle, and this is like going into the weeds on Bleak House, so if you don't know the novel, don't worry about it. But both of them, what they do is they just Mrs. Particle in particular marches into a poor person's cottage, plumps herself down, reads a tract aloud, and hands out tracts to people who don't have written literacy and can't cope with them, and then sweeps out again without, you know, taking care of the ill, giving them food, asking them how they're doing, asking them what their needs are. Remember that care is about meeting another's needs, and you have to know what those needs are. Mrs. Particle in Bleak House just decides, as the lady visitor, their need is to become better Christians. And that's not their need. They're starving to death. Their children are dying. You know, there's domestic violence in the family. There's fever, maybe not a putrid fever, but there's a fever, you know, so there's a lot of things that she could be doing, but she's not meeting a need. So one of the things I love about that definition, meeting another's need, is that it implies communication. The person who needs care must tell you what the problem is, and you, if you're the person who gives the care, must say, is this helping? Does this work? Can I do something else? What about that? And that's when it's a community of care. But the other thing is, as I said, care communities need to be egalitarian, as in like the Harvilles and, you know, the Musgroves giving each other dinners, taking care of each other's kids. It's hard to imagine how that would work with a lady visitor visiting the poor, right? How could the poor give care and response? And we've all been in this situation where somebody takes care of you and you really want to like respond. You want to reciprocate. That's a natural thing. That's a thing we all kind of instinctively know in a care relationship. It needs to be reciprocal and egalitarian. And it's very frustrating when you can't do that, right? When you can't reciprocate. So it's possible, maybe not. And I also just want to say somebody also asked a question about examples of men giving care, which might fit into this question. One great example is in Great Expectations when Joe Gargery gives care to Pip. Pip is very ill, and Joe is he says is like a woman, you know, smooths his brow, gives him cooling drink, carries him up the stairs, really takes care of him. So there are actually quite a lot of male caregivers. Often their function is to carry people because wheelchairs aren't yet quite invented. There are kind of bad versions of wheelchairs that don't work that well. So often it's to push wheelchairs or to carry people in and out. There's one novel, John Halifax Gentleman, in which the disabled person is literally pushed in a wheelbarrow. But so he meets his best friend, possible love interest, because he's a boy who is strong enough to kind of push the wheelbarrow.
Cool. Yeah, I was thinking in Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, there is the caregiving there of, you know, Mrs. Hale when she's ill in a new community where she knows nobody, but also Margaret's helping, you know, the daughter of the factory worker, Bessie. And she continues to go to her until, you know, she dies. So they create the community of care in a totally different social class.
Absolutely. And I would love to see people working on this. I don't want to be the only person working on this. I want everybody to like think about
this. It's a wonderful topic.
But I would
it really is a wonderful topic. And thank you for just generating such lively discussion and thought-provoking analysis.
Yeah, but I would love to see people, you know, thinking through in what conditions can cross-class relations be genuine care communities. Is it ever possible? And again, this might be a case. I suspect it is a case where a literary fantasy would depart from lived reality. I mean, you know, if a poor person didn't want, you know, the particular sort of fabric that you know the lady of the manor was giving them, maybe the lady is giving them like very sturdy fabric, you know, very practical fabric, and they want something prettier. Can they really say no thanks? I don't know. You know, care doesn't work if you can't push back. It has to be corrected all the time. You have to have that conversation all the time. So I'm skeptical that it could really happen in real life as a care community, but I think it happens all the time in fiction because fiction is done by primarily the fiction we read tends to be done by middle-class people, often female, who want to believe that it could happen.
This could happen. Yeah, that's a good point. Are there any other questions, Eric?
I think we are kind of running out of time, and we probably wind down. Now, what we can do with Talia, with your permission, do you mind if we share your email?
Yes, I just said, please share my email. So if you have questions, please contact me.
Wonderful, wonderful. We thank you for your generosity there. And of course, this is going to be recorded and will be posted on our website very shortly after the conclusion of this talk. And so you can go back, listen to it, listen to the Q&A if you need the name of a title again or something like that. And of course, there's Talia's email. Deb, do you want to talk about our next event for Jane Austen and Company?
Yeah, sure. The next event will take place on Monday, April 29th. And it'll have Laura Rockland, who will be speaking about her portrayals of Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte on stage. Laura is a produced playwright whose credits include an original adaptation of Jane Eyre, which she co-authored with Sally Boyett, being performed at the Classic Theater of Maryland. And she also did a one-woman play, Charlotte Bronte, To Do More and Better Things, that was presented as part of the North American Friends of Chawton House, their 2021 speaker subscription series. And on May 15th, please join us for a visit with Lizzie Dunford of the Jane Austen House and Anne Dinsdale of the Bronte Parsonage for an interactive discussion. So we know that not everyone can afford to support this program, which is exactly why we want to keep it free. But if you can, please consider donating at this link now, or when you register for the next 2 upcoming events. Every little bit really makes a huge difference. So thank you.
Yes, and we definitely want to thank Talia Schaffer for taking time to be with us this evening, or this middle of the night if you're in a different time zone. But thank you so much, Talia, for joining us. We really appreciate you. And just as a reminder to everybody, this is recorded and it will be available on our website very soon. One final plug for the writing contest that we have going on. The deadline is tomorrow, and you can go to our website to learn more about the rules and instructions. But thank you again, everybody, for attending. We really appreciate you all, and we hope to see you back here on April 29th. All right, thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.